All right. Good morning. This is Mrs. Politsky, and we are covering Chapter 17, Section 4, and eventually Chapter 25, Section 2 of your World History Notes today. And to start with, we're going to talk a little bit about medieval Japan and Korea. So take a look at your sheets. We're going to be starting kind of halfway through your packet. So if you need a moment, you might want to pause, and we'll get started here in a moment. All right. Take a look at question number 1. The samurai were professionally trained warriors who were hired by landowners and were highly respected in Japanese society. The advantages in number 2 of a dominant military class were that the samurai would enjoy the respect that he received and would work hard to protect those whose safety depended upon them. Number 3, the daimyo, who we talked a little bit about yesterday, were the warlords who held large estates and battled one another for power. And eventually, we had a series of daimyos that took power in Japan. And eventually, they would be known as the Tokugawa rulers. And so, in number 4, the Tokugawa rulers found it necessary to impose strict rules because previous shogunates had lost power. And the Tokugawa rulers wanted to keep this from happening again. Moving on. Number 5. During the Tokugawa shogunate, the 3 classes that were below the warrior class were the peasants, the artisans, and the merchants. They were kind of the lower middle class of society. Women during the Tokugawa period led restrictive lives. Many were obedient to the male head of the household or had lost many rights and freedoms as a result of this. Number 7, in time, Jesuit priests would come to Japan, along with a lot of other Europeans. To better serve the Japanese people, the Jesuits adopted the Japanese language. And this was a custom that the Jesuits had adopted years before when they were in Europe. When they would go and try to convert people, they would always try to make sure that they adapted to the culture to kind of win the hearts over. Okay, in Japan, then they learned the Japanese language, but they also learned the custom of receiving guests in what we call a tea room. And if you look down below, there's a picture here of a tea room, the table and sunken benches there. So during the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan changed its relationship with the West. And initially, European traders had been welcomed, but in time, the shoguns grew concerned of the widespread conversions of people to Christianity. And thus, they began to restrict trade and travel. And by 1650, Japan was again mostly closed to European trade. There had been one agreement that had been established towards the end of this Tokugawa shogunate, and that was so that the Dutch were the only ones who would be received, and they would be received in one harbor in Japan, and that would be the harbor of Edo. Edo today is Tokyo. Number 9. The 3 decrees used to isolate Japan from the rest of the world around the year 1636 were only the Dutch could travel with the travel to Japan or travel with the Japanese. And any Japanese citizen who would travel abroad, meaning travel away from Japan, would be killed if they would ever return. So if you had left Japan, chances are you probably would never go home. And then finally, no large ships would be built by the Japanese. What they would do instead is build smaller ships that could travel between the different islands, but nothing that would be big enough for overseas travel. And number 10, the three classes that benefited most economically during Japan's long isolation was the samurai and also the daimyos, because they sold rice and they produced this rice on their own land. Merchants also made some cash during this time because they lent money to the samurai and the daimyos. And as a result, these groups would eventually become very wealthy by the time we get to about the middle of the 19th century. All right, taking a look at chapter 25, section 2, East Asia and the West. We're going to talk about how both China and eventually Japan were uh, opened up to trade by the Western powers. So we're going to start with China. And number one, British merchants broke China's trade barriers by trading opium in exchange for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. Uh, Next time that we're all back together, we're going to take a look at a video that's going to go a little bit more in depth about this. But in a kind of a sad way of putting it, the British, when they came to China, they were a bunch of drug dealers. That's really what it's coming down to. And they were backed by the British government. So the British government, the sun never sets on us. Yeah, a bunch of drug dealers. Okay, that's kind of how that's all going to go about. All right, number two, the unequal treaties between China and the imperialistic powers had the following two effects. First, they increased the foreign influence. In other words, the outsiders are now in charge. And then it also weakened the Qing dynasty, which eventually led to the Chinese losing the power of their government to these foreigners that are coming in. All right, number three. In 1900, the Boxers, okay, who are pictured down below here, also known as the Society of the Righteous Fist, killed hundreds of foreigners and Chinese Christians that had tried to divide up their empire and eventually trying to get rid of these imperialists. The Boxers themselves wanted to bring back the traditional way of life. And what they were trying to do is to get people who were foreigners to pack up and to leave. In 1905, the nationalists are those people who want their own country. Okay, we've talked about what nationalism is a while back, pride in one's country. Nationalists in China, they chose a man named Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen actually would eventually become the leader of China for a time. 6 years after he became the leader, the Qing dynasty was overthrown and China became a democracy. Sun Yat-sen actually had gone to the United States at some point in time during the 19th century and had been educated in California. He had spent some time in Hawaii. And matter of fact, if you go to Honolulu, there's statues of the man because he's so well loved by the Hawaiians. But in time, he ended up back in China and would eventually lead them to kind of take control of their government. In Japan, the Japanese, they began trading with the outside world after years of isolation in the year 1853, excuse me, when a man named Matthew Perry, aka Commodore Perry, this dude right here, sailed into Edo Bay. This is before the American Civil War. And Perry was under the orders of the president at the time to go to Edo and to kind of make an impression on the Japanese people that they need to open the door and start trading with the West. And so Perry and his ships, they pulled into the harbor and they put on a little demonstration of their cannons. Fire a few cannons. They're not aiming at the people necessarily that are off on the shore or the city itself, but the idea that look at how impressive our firepower is and look at our impressive ships. In time, the Japanese sent envoys out and the negotiations began. Okay. And within a year or so, there's an agreement. And Japan literally goes from kind of being in the Middle Ages, still living under a feudal state in 1853. Within 50 years, they will be one of the most modern nations in the Far East. In other words, what took us 500 years took them 50 years as far as modernizing themselves. All right, number 6. The Meiji rulers tried to make Japan a great power by bringing the forms of parliamentary government to Japan. They also wanted to strengthen the military, and this might come back to haunt us, okay, by the time we get to the 1940s. And they also wanted to industrialize. In other words, bring factories, modernize, the economy as a result of that. They also wanted to establish a universal educational system. That way we can start educating the people. And they were able to achieve pretty much all of these. The parliamentary government was established. In time, though, as the military strengthens, we have a situation where the military will eventually take power in Japan. And this is happening kind of after the First World War, 1920s into the 1930s. And that becomes a problem for us down the road when we talk about the Second World War, because it's a military government by that time. Industrialization, they were building factories left and right. Those factories were producing round the clock. Universal education, meaning everyone gets to go to school. It doesn't matter if you're a boy or a girl, or if you're rich or poor, everybody has that opportunity. And number 7, Japan's victory in what is known as the Sino-Japanese War, and eventually the Russo-Japanese War. Sino fought between China and Japan, and Russo fought between Russia and Japan. Basically proved that European empires could be defeated by a smaller nation. For number 8, the Treaty of Versailles, which was a treaty that ended World War I, granted control of the Shandong Peninsula of northeastern China to Japan, not Korea. As a result of some of the wars that had been fought, like the Sino-Japanese War, Japan actually had a lot of territory that they were accumulating in what would become mainland China. Okay, and so this peninsula, for the most part, goes into the hands of the Japanese and thus increases their influence. By 1912, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, pictured down below here, declared China a republic. A republic doesn't always mean that you're a stable democracy, but it doesn't mean that you allow for elections. Okay, but soon he would be ousted by Yuan Shikai. Okay, and he would come to power and stay there for a while. Done. Number 10, with aid from the Soviet Union, an ambitious military officer known as Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang Party defeated warlords and established another national government in 1928. When Chiang Kai-shek turned against them, tens of thousands of communists eventually would flee into the mountains in the south, okay, led by a guy named Mao Zedong. This event of the Chinese communists fleeing Chiang and his followers was known as the Long March, which we're going to talk about. Pursued by the Kuomintang, the Red Army, which would be the Communist Army of China, lost more than 90,000 troops in an arduous one-year retreat known as the Long March. Okay, the Communists are going to remember this down the line. when they have the upper hand. And number 14, as the Red Army or the Communist Army and the Kuomintang battled each other, a large section of northeast China, known as Manchuria, would eventually be taken by you know who, the Japanese. And as a result of this, we actually have a truce between the Red Army and the Kuomintang, okay, the nationalist. All right, well, thank you very much, and make sure that you get everything written down.